Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight as Executive Director of Sustainable Woodstock. And on behalf of our board and the co-host for this event, Pentangle Arts, I would like to say how excited and delighted we are to bring you Q&A with our award-winning reporter, documentary filmmaker, and professor of journalism, David Abel. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're very excited to celebrate Earth Day with this event. We are based in Vermont. Let us begin by honoring the cultural, spiritual, and environmental traditions of the Abenaki, the indigenous peoples of these lands. This beautiful place that we all love is here because of the wisdom and stewardship of the indigenous ancestors and elders, past and present. We would also like to express our sincere thanks to our partner for this event, Pentangle Arts, and to the Vermont Humanities, whose support helped to make this event possible. All right, now I would like to introduce Sustainable Woodstock's program coordinator, Heather Knoll.
Thank you, Ginevra. Now I am very excited to introduce you to our guest this evening, an award-winning reporter, documentary filmmaker, and professor of journalism. David Abel has covered war in the Balkans, unrest in Latin America, national security issues in Washington, D.C., terrorism in New York and Boston, and climate change and poverty throughout New England. A longtime reporter at the Boston Globe, Abel is also a professor of the practice in journalism at Boston University. And we are very excited to welcome David Abel this evening.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Ginevra. It is so nice to be with you all tonight. Thank you, Sustainable Woodstock. Thank you to the Pentangle Arts Center for gathering everybody here tonight. And I'm sort of having a bit of a flashback to 4 years ago in a good way and a bad way, but it is really awesome to be able to connect with you all. This is, I think, one of the few good legacies of the pandemic, that we now have this means of gathering. I'll be brief. I don't want to keep you from the film. I'll just say a few words about the making of this film. So I have spent the past 2 years working on this project after years of working as a reporter covering climate change for the Boston Globe. And over the years, I have been writing about report after report after report about how our seas are rising and what the latest projections are. And it seemed that every report would have an even worse worst case scenario than the previous report, to the point that a few years ago, I wrote about the most recent report about the projections for sea level rise on Boston Harbor. And it was an astounding 50% worse than the report just 5 years before, with the unimaginable or incomprehensible notion that if we do suffer the worst of climate change and we do not get control of our emissions, we could see the sea levels in Boston, around Boston Harbor, and obviously elsewhere. But the projections are that we are going to see sea level rise higher in the Northeast than elsewhere because of the way gravity works. But the projections were that, as you will see in the film, that seas could rise as much as 15 feet by the end of this century. And at the same time, as I was covering these reports, like a lot of people who live where I do in Boston, and other people visiting, I was experiencing this tremendous cognitive dissonance watching as we began to build an entirely new urban district at sea level on landfill, hard on the coast, and in a city that has probably more climate scientists per capita than just about any other city on the planet, we were building this new urban district, spending billions of dollars doing so in the bullseye of rising seas, which the film will explain. And so I was hoping to try to tell the story about how sea level rise is not some distant abstract threat, but one that presents a clear and present danger, one that we are already experiencing. And so that led me to produce this film.
A question before we started was, who was the speaker with the Russian accent, question mark Russian, who spoke about climate suicide, if not climate action?
Oh, that was not a Russian accent. It was a Portuguese accent, and you are referring to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who you hear at the beginning of the film, and then we come back to him at the end.
So I've got a question here from Jane. When will the Back Bay flood? Will it reach Marlborough Street?
That's a good question. So a lot of Boston is built on landfill, and of course, the Back Bay is famously also built on landfill, and projections suggest that it is also quite vulnerable to rising seas. So as seas rise, there is going to be greater challenges of keeping a place like the Back Bay dry, as well as other portions of Boston, including the South End is vulnerable to rising seas. Much of Dorchester, where I used to work at the old Boston Globe headquarters, which shut down a few years ago. There are even years ago, it was quite prone to flooding, and there was a road that led out of where we worked, and on super high tides or king tides, you sometimes couldn't get out. We would sort of be blocked in because it's hard against the harbor. But I was just reading today about projections that by the end of this decade, in the 2030s, we could see, a major storm flood, could essentially inundate much of the seaport, and also portions of the Back Bay and other parts of coastal Boston, East Boston, downtown Boston, and of course many other parts of the coastline, all across the eastern seaboard, are incredibly vulnerable to rising seas and to storm surge. And we saw that, if you recall, probably yesterday in a lot of places, but to a greater extent in January, just a few months ago, we had some of the highest tides on record in places like Maine and New Hampshire, where there was a huge amount of damage. We're talking about tens to hundreds of millions of dollars probably worth of damage in coastal Maine. We had the fourth highest tides on record in Boston Harbor as well.
This person says, any thoughts about the coastline around Boston? I hear Ipswich is having flooding.
Yeah, and someone in the comments notes, sorry, the Secretary General's name, I should have said this, is Antonio Guterres, and I neglected to mention his full name. It's in the film. Yes, Ipswich is also vulnerable, and much of Cape Ann is incredibly vulnerable to rising seas. We actually have shown the film on Cape Ann a few times in Rockport, as well as Ipswich, because there's great interest in these issues, which are playing out all across coastal areas across the world, really. And the reality is that the seaport is just a prism for the larger issues that this film seeks to reflect on. We Coastal cities and coastal communities around the world are incredibly vulnerable to rising seas now, and are going to be far more so in the coming years. But what distinguishes a place like the seaport from many other vulnerable areas around the world is that, unlike, let's say, Miami or Jakarta or a place like the Marshall Islands, this neighborhood, as I said at the outset, was built well after we understood the threats of rising seas.
So Jenny has a question. Is Boston planning on building a seawall?
At the moment, no. It's conceivable that that could be in the cards in the future. But in 2018, there was a study done about some of the ideas that you heard about in the film. There was a University of Massachusetts Boston report looking at the potential for us to build a harbor-wide barrier to protect Boston, similar to what New Bedford built. And the estimates were that it would cost more than $11 billion to build, and that it could take as long as 30 years to build it. And the folks at the University of Massachusetts who studied this recommended against it, in part because such a open and closed kind of barrier wouldn't really protect the city from sea level rise, so that we are going to need shoreside barriers as well. There are other options like building an inner harbor barrier that would cut off the city from like Logan Airport to South Boston, where the seaport really starts. And that it would be less expensive, but it's something that might have to be considered at some point if we want to protect a 400-year-old city from seas that could rise by the end of this decade more than 10 feet.
Thank you. Our next question here. Hi, amazing film. Thank you so much. Do the new buildings in the Inundation District have flood insurance?
Thank you for that question. And yes, I believe most of them have insurance, as far as I know. But the question is how much that insurance is going to ultimately cover the costs if we have a massive flooding event. And what we have seen repeatedly when we have had these immense storms like Sandy, which devastated much of coastal New Jersey and coastal New York, and the major hurricanes that have battered lots of Florida and the East Coast, and other major storms. I should add, one of the signs that climate change is not some distant abstract threat, but one that is affecting us now and is increasingly becoming a part of our lives, is that last year we had a record 28 storms that cost more than $1 billion worth of damage in the United States. That was by far a record. It exceeded the number of storms that cost that amount of money in 2020, when I believe we had 22, and it is well above the average of such storms that we had just a few decades ago. In the 1990s, I believe on average we had maybe 6 or 8 of those storms on an annual basis. So we are seeing this play out far more regularly now. And sorry, what was the essence of the question again, about?
The flood insurance, basically.
Yeah. So my point was that the likelihood is that unless we have some other system, if we have a catastrophic storm that's going to inundate the seaport, there's going to be a lot of other places damaged, and eventually, it's probably that the backstop will be us, taxpayers.
Next question. Thank you for hosting this event. How can we share this important documentary easily with others?
Thank you for that question. So, if you like the film, if you appreciated it, word of mouth is really important to us, and so please tell your friends, tell your neighbors, and post about it on social media. At the moment, we are just showing the film in theaters and at film festivals, and in settings like this, but we will be bringing it eventually to streaming platforms, and we just received an offer to have a national broadcast of the film on PBS, which might be happening in the fall, but we're still in negotiations about whether that's going to happen. But thank you. The more you spread the word, we would appreciate it, because our hope is to bring this film to as many audiences as possible. And if you have suggestions for where we might screen the film, you can reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat, but it's dabel@globe.com. And you can go onto our website, which is inundationdistrict.com, and you can find me that way as well, or you can reach out to our impact producer.
Thank you. Very exciting to hear that it might be on PBS.
Thanks.
Our next question here: what are some of the most important actions individuals can take to combat climate change?
I am frequently asked that question, and I think the most important response I could give you is to vote. There are a lot of individual actions that we can all take. We could eat less or no meat. We could fly less. We could drive electric vehicles. We could convert our gas or oil heating systems to using heat pumps and other electricity-based ways of heating and cooling your home. And those are all important. But what I would say, this is an international problem and a national problem. And while we all should be doing our part individually, what's most important is having the national and international policies that are going to collectively curb our emissions. As you see in the end of the film, we are clearly not going in the right direction. We are supposed to reduce our the likelihood that we are going to see the worst impacts of climate change, and not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this decade. We're supposed to cut our emissions roughly by half by the end of this decade. And instead, we are on track to increase them. And we are probably undercounting our emissions. So we're probably going to exceed them by more than current estimates suggest at the moment. So we need policymakers and politicians, leaders who are in power, who are going to make the decisions, the hard, politically charged, and sometimes painful decisions to reduce our emissions and to press other leaders around the world and other countries around the world to take similar action and to incent them or to coerce them somehow. Um, so, in short, the most important thing I think anyone can do right now is to ensure that you vote for people who are going to take climate change seriously, and that being one of the most existential concerns of our time, that your vote is centered around that, perhaps more than any other issue.
Thank you. Next question is from Heidi. The mayor speaks generally about supporting climate change measures. Is there anything specific she's undertaking that was not referred to in the film?
Great question. So there are a lot of ideas out there, and there are a lot of things that have happened over the last 6 months or so since we started, since we really completed the film. One example that may seem symbolic, but is meant to have practical consequences, is that the mayor just rechristened the department in Boston that was really responsible for sanctioning the development of the seaport. It's called the Boston. It was called the Boston Planning and Development Agency, known by the acronym BPDA, in Boston, and it was very controversial. The mayor, when she was a city councilor, was very critical of this department, as were a lot of people, because it had this kind of conflicting mission where it was sort of working on two things at the same time, which was planning and development, which might seem like the same word, but they can have conflicting goals. And so she now has essentially rechristened it the Boston Planning Department. And the idea behind that is that we will start to think about resilience and take climate change into account, as well as other things like affordability and other concerns that are not necessarily the primary concerns of the developers, who are often looking to build towers, find lucrative tenants, and then maybe get out.
I got lost there, but I think it's my turn.
Yeah.
This is a bigger one. What did the redevelopment authority think about developing in a flood zone? And what is the plan for recovery in the area after a bad flood? And how are the insurance companies okay with the buildings repeatedly flooding? So,
well, I think that if you go back 20, 25 years, as the former mayor, Thomas M. Menino, came up with this idea that we would create this so-called Inundation District. There were a lot of good reasons to want to develop this area. It had, for, as you heard in the film, for many decades, for basically a century, been vacant land. It was parking lots, abandoned warehouses for the most part, and it was valuable waterfront property. And for many years, for generations really, nobody wanted to build there, because it was this area, this former train depot, I guess it was originally designed to be, um, was hard on the most polluted harbor in the country. And it was essentially a cesspool, Boston Harbor. You had all of these sewers essentially flooding into the harbor, and it stank, and nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to live there. But then we spent, as a city, as a state, and we had national money, billions of dollars to clean up Boston Harbor. And so all of a sudden, there was this new clean harbor, and there was all this valuable real estate, and the city provided all kinds of incentives for developers to build there. But what they didn't do was provide incentives for them to take sea level rise into account and to build in a way that would be sustainable for the long term. And that was despite lots of people saying that they should be doing that. But the insurance companies went ahead with it, and they, maybe had good reason to insure these properties because they were thinking of short term. Insurance is essentially a short term proposition, not a long term proposition, and so you might insure on an annual policy. I'm not sure how long these insurance policies are good for, but presumably insurance rates are going to rise significantly, and they're expected to rise. They've already risen in places all over the country that are vulnerable to rising seas, such as places like Florida, where I don't believe you can get private insurance for coastal development at this point. There's a state insurer essentially that's the backstop, and it's also the case in a lot of areas in the West, in California, where there have been lots of wildfires destroying lots of property.
Our next question here is, are the resale values of the condos in the seaport being impacted by the awareness of this reality?
That's a great question. I think more people will hopefully have to see my film before that happens. I was happy to learn this week that we actually just booked our first screening in the seaport, and we tried to we did have a screening at the we've had a bunch of screenings in Boston and one not far from the seaport at the New England Aquarium, but I have this vision of holding a screening on, I don't know, maybe a gorilla screening on one of the buildings or something like that. But Boston has a limited amount of housing, and right now there's still a great demand for housing in Boston, and we have seen a lot of continued development. That, however, is changing from commercial real estate point of view, not for condos, and that, though, is not so much a reflection of the recognition that sea level rise is a growing concern, although it could be, but I think it's more a reflection of how our society has changed, as evidence of what we're doing at the moment. Fewer people are going into offices, and so the value of commercial real estate has declined, and that could have an impact on future development in the seaport as well.
Thank you. Our next question. Thank you, David, for making this film. Who is financing the new development? So I suppose the development in the seaport.
Well, it's private developers. And at the beginning, there were lots of tax incentives for people to build there. And I don't know, I presume there have still been tax incentives. I know the city and the state provided tax incentives for Amazon to base a good amount of their operations there. I know Fidelity is still building and I think nearing the completion of its new headquarters in right on the water. There are lots of new companies that have built there. General Electric, GE, had planned its headquarters there, but for a variety of, I believe, economic reasons, decided to pull out. And there have been some other new changes that I've heard about from some of the larger companies, but I think they're mainly economic decisions at this point that aren't necessarily related to climate change or rising seas.
What is your sense from researchers on the projected timing of the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheets?
Well, if you are someone like me who's consuming this kind of news all the time, it's frightening. I mean, we are seeing all kinds of apocalyptic signs, like last year being the warmest year on record. We've already exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold in a 12-month month by month cycle. We are seeing the oceans right now at their warmest state in record in on record, and all of those things combine to cause the glaciers to melt at an accelerating rate. I can't predict the future. I'm not a glaciologist, so I can't really comment on the ultimate health of the Antarctic glaciers. But everything I read seems to frighten the hell out of me, at least.
Well, that's something. This is going back to the insurance question. I don't know if you know, but who is insuring the buildings? Do you know what insurer?
My understanding is that there are lots of different insurance companies. There are lots of buildings in the seaport.
Thank you for this film. Is the ground underneath the built-up areas safe from washing away and or collapsing?
Well, it is built on landfill, and I again am not an engineer, so I am not the best person to answer that question. But certainly, we have seen water come up from through the storm drains, and in major rain events, major storms, there is backup that's coming through a kind of porous landfill structure of the ground, and that very well could pose a problem. But I think a lot of the development was built in ways to be structurally sound. But it might just mean that they become kind of islands to themselves when when the ocean washes into the streets, as you saw in the film in 2018. We've already gotten a taste of that, and even in January we got another taste of that.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know the full history of Boston being built on land that was created, so that was a really interesting part of the film. The next question has to do with erosion as well. I think it's referring to what about the erosion of these buildings? Is it being looked at? So I don't know if you have anything additional to add.
I don't really know what that means, erosion of the building, so I don't know if I can answer that.
No, fair. The next one is a comment here. Thank you, David. We need to expose the results of poor decisions and what possible solutions there are. It's pretty bleak. And it will be great to be able to share it. I hope the PBS deal goes through. Some thank yous and congratulations. Did I miss any questions? The next one I get to is, we can go back, Heather, if you find any, but is, what are your feelings about proposed engineered protection?
Well, so there are ideas about, as you heard in the film, nature-based solutions that might provide protections that would reduce the impacts of storm surge, and I think that is something what we'll see over the next decade or so. That we will see our coast and lots of the areas built in ways that can absorb water. We've already seen New York City, which is also downtown Manhattan, is incredibly vulnerable to rising seas as well. And they have this idea of this thing called a big U, which is this multi-billion-dollar project to defend Manhattan, lower Manhattan in particular, from rising seas. And they just completed, I think, what is considered the first element of that project, and it's a park that is designed to, I think it goes into the East River in Manhattan, and it's essentially designed to have vegetation that can survive in brackish water or salt water. And so for most of the time, it's parkland, and it's great because it gives more green space to the city. But on major storms, it's meant to absorb water, and there's a seawall essentially built into the project. But it doesn't look like hard engineered infrastructure as much as it does feel like nature, although I haven't been there, so I shouldn't really say that. But at least that's the idea. And we'll hopefully see more of those kinds of things in vulnerable areas all along the coast. But of course, that is really expensive, and I don't know if you can protect the entire coast of Boston or other cities with that amount, with that kind of protection. It might just be too expensive.
So oh no, we've got a couple more questions. Thanks again. What do you think the mayor and lawmakers should do at this point?
That's the question I'm sort of asking as well, and I don't know ultimately what the answer to that is, but we can't wait too much time, and coming together and figuring out what are the most effective solutions, what are the most economically and economically sound, environmentally sound solutions is what is important. These are going to be expensive decisions, and they're going to take time, and we need to start essentially implementing these sooner than later. And ultimately, they will involve a range of options, but we're going to need shoreside barriers, some way, shape, or form, to defend our city if we're going to stay there. Otherwise, we will probably have to retreat at some point.
Our last question here is, are you familiar with Janine Benyus? I'm not sure how to say her name, and her work with biomimicry solutions. And they've put a link here on what I assume is her website.
I will check it out. I'm not familiar with this person's work. Maybe I am, actually. I'm just opening this up.
I'm not seeing anything else here in the chat unless we missed anything. So that might be our last question here. Is there anything else that you kind of have on your mind from those questions or from reflecting with us?
I would just say that I think a lot of my answers and a lot of the conversation are pretty depressing, and I don't want to leave on such a dour note. I would just say that um, we have we have done as a species, human beings, a lot of amazing things. I think um, we have had a huge impact on the natural world, um, and we are not condemned to uh, the apocalyptic future that is maybe sketched out in this film. Um, we could change our trajectory. And my hope is that with if we come together, if we can employ technology, we could do something like we did during the pandemic, which was astounding compared to what anyone thought at the very beginning of the pandemic. We were able to use this new technology, mRNA technology, which was basically brand new, to develop vaccines in the course of 1 year that ultimately saved millions of people's lives. And and I know there are a lot of people working on all kinds of new technological innovations that could play a role in bending the curve to reducing our emissions. And I just think that rather than ending on a dour note, I want to say that if we have the right people leading us, and we are making the right investments and making wiser decisions, our future could hopefully be far better than living underwater. And hopefully that doesn't happen literally or fiscally. So I'll end there, but thank you all so much. I really appreciate your interest in the film, and thank you, Ginevra and Heather, for organizing this.
Thank you very much for joining us, David. I want to encourage the audience to explore David's other work, including his very recent film, In the Whale, which is an award-winning feature-length film about arguably the greatest fish story ever told. Though this one is true, is his caveat. It's the account of a man who survived to tell the tale of being swallowed by a whale and what happened after he escaped. So we will send out a link to some info on that, although that one is also still in the works in terms of being streamed to the public. And otherwise, I just want to thank you very much, David. Our sincere thanks for sharing this evening with us, and to everyone for joining. And we wish you all a very safe and happy Earth Day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Good night.
Okay. Good night, everybody.